Hi, I'm Tyson Franklin, and welcome to this week's episode of the Podiatry Legends podcast. Podcast designed to help you feel, see, and think differently about the podiatry profession. Today is a solo episode. It's a little bit different, and I'm going to talk and discuss my lower back injury that I had over Easter. I want to take you through what actually happened, and the reason I want to talk about it is because there's been a few lessons and takeaways that I think are definitely worth sharing. Firstly, it was not one specific injury. It didn't happen at Muay Thai. It didn't happen actually lifting weights at the gym. It was an accumulation of just smaller aggravations that I probably should have paid more attention to, but I didn't. And then without any real warning, I just developed these really severe right sciatic symptoms and pain. And when I say developed, I mean it just hit me like a ton of bricks. Now, I've had AC joint injuries. I've torn both my calf muscles. Once I tore them both at the same time. That was a lot of fun. I've had an avulsion fracture of my wrist, but nothing has been as painful or as debilitating as a sciatic nerve problem. If you've had it, you probably know what I'm talking about. And yes, I had radiating pain from my butt right down to the dorsal of my foot. Had all the associated numbness and pain, especially first, second, and third toe. So classic sciatic symptoms. And if you've had it, like I said, you know exactly what I mean. And I could not walk. I couldn't take a step without this radiating pain down my leg. 3 steps was probably about my limit before I actually had to hold on to something. I couldn't sit like how I'm sitting now. I was unable to sit without pain. Also meant I couldn't drive. I was totally reliant on my wife Christine to get me to all my medical appointments. I've never felt so helpless in my life. I had to cancel coaching calls that I had scheduled in. I had to cancel podcast recordings. I had to cancel social outings, and also my speaking engagement at the Ontario Society of Chiropodists conference in Canada, which I was so looking forward to. And that was combined with a 3.5-week holiday that I was supposed to have because I was not able to fly. It was just impossible. The only bright side was that because we had 3.5 weeks blocked out for this trip, for the conference and a bit of travel afterwards, it actually allowed me time to seek all the diagnostic and treatment that I required. And also, Christine was able to take me to all my daily appointments. As expected, had MRI, CT, it revealed I had multiple bulging discs in the lumbar and sacral area. And this is my first takeaway. I'm actually going to share 5 takeaways with you. So this is my first one, is be more empathetic. I think until you've experienced a problem yourself, I don't think you truly understand it fully. Now, I recall patients over the years telling me that they'd had sciatic pain, or they'd had it in the past, they had sciatic symptoms, and I listened, and I like to think I did care, but probably not to the extent I would now if anybody ever tells me that they have had sciatic pain. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, Tyson, I'm already a very empathetic podiatrist. And if that is true with all your patients, they will be thanking you. But I think it doesn't matter what your level of empathy is, it can always be improved. Whatever you think it is right now, just increase it. Be more empathetic. Your patients will definitely appreciate it. And I know some patients do complain more, and they should or may actually have low pain threshold, but still, what I've really learned from this is be empathetic to other people's problems and pain. And when you ask a patient how they are, don't just go through the motions. Think about the tone of your voice and your body language. That is so important. You can be looking at your computer and just say, oh, how's everything going? Or you can lean in and ask them, how is everything going? That is totally different. Actually show that you care. Now, over this process, when this first happened, my usual GP that I saw was unavailable, so I had to see someone that worked for her. Now, after a number of visits, it was really clear to me that this GP had zero empathy, zero care factor. Well, that's how it seemed to me anyway. He had this monotone voice. There was no sort of direct eye contact. He asked me questions, but was constantly just looking at his computer and typing notes while he was doing it. And so I was in so much pain, and it was so frustrating because I would leave each appointment feeling unheard. And if you've ever got patients that are leaving your clinic feeling unheard, it is never going to end positively. So I know I was never like that with my own patients, but I still know I could have been more empathetic at times. But I also know that when you're busy, when you're overworked, if you're tired, and if you're an employee and you sometimes might just feel unappreciated, never let this affect your care factor for your patients. I've always been under the belief, and I've told my coaching clients this, that the patient you see 8:30 a.m. Monday morning deserves the same care, attention, and empathy as the patient you see at 5:30 p.m. on Friday. No matter what is happening in your life, the patient deserves your best self. So that is my first takeaway. Be more empathetic and always be your best self when you're with your patients. So my second takeaway, you need to protect yourself financially. And let me explain. Like over the years, over the decades, podiatry has been very good to me financially. And I feel it was deserved because I worked my ass off. I worked really hard. So having a few weeks off or months at this stage of my life right now is of no financial consequence. But if I was an employee right now or a solo practitioner, not being able to work for 3 or 4 weeks would be financially devastating. Even this week, week 4, or towards the end of week 4, I'm still very limited because of the pain that is still involved with walking and sitting. And on top of this, I still have medical appointments I've got to go to. So 2 days ago, I was able to see my usual GP, and she is awesome. And she said, this particular problem may continue for another month. And I was like, oh, that's great. I was very optimistic. She said, but it could take a year depending on how I respond to treatment. So I'll keep you posted as this goes on. So the second takeaway was all about, are you financially protected? This is really important. Do you have cash reserves for emergencies, or at least income protection insurance? Now, I want to share another story with you that when I was 22, I set up my first clinic on the Gold Coast. I was a solo practitioner with one receptionist, and it grew pretty quick. It was great. And as far as I was concerned, I was 6 foot tall and bulletproof. Nothing was ever going to happen to me. And to be truthful, I'm not actually 6 foot tall, but you get the point. Anyway, about 2 years into owning my practice, when I was about 24, I had this insurance guy who kept bugging me, and he would drop in every now and then, and he was always talking to me about income protection and also business expense insurance. And I kept looking at the costs and just going, I can't afford it. I really can't afford it. I don't need it. I'm 6 foot tall, bulletproof. But eventually I gave in and I took out the insurance. And I must admit, he was a very persistent salesperson, which in the end, it worked out quite well, because 3 months later, I was off of work with a severe hand problem. All of a sudden, I had this bad psoriasis, joint inflammation. And this is the important part. From the time that happened and I went off insurance, I never, ever worked in that practice again. Fortunately, like I said, I had income protection. However, this is something that's really important to note. Income protection or income protection insurance generally does not pay you at the same wage as if you were working. It's designed to replace a portion of your income, typically 75 to 85%, depending on what you're paying, of your pre-tax, pre-disability earnings. And remember, this is still income. So you still may need to pay tax on this. Just be prepared for that. Now, this is the good news, and I was so glad that I also had business expense insurance. The usual monthly expenses for the business was looked after. Rent, lease repayments, your phone, electricity, all the other running costs. And I was able to get a few podiatry friends to work a day or so a week, which was taken into account with the insurer, so they'd balance that out. I was getting by, but even though my income protection was ongoing, and I think the policy I had, I could have stayed on it till I was 65, and then they're probably just expecting I'd go into some form of old age pension. I have no idea. But this is the important part. The business expense insurance was only payable for 12 months. It wasn't ongoing as well. So I had to make a really important decision. What was I going to do with the clinic? In the end, I sold it to a local podiatrist in the area, and they got it for a really, really good price. And the reason I got it for a good price was because it was a forced sale. But under the circumstances, it worked out okay for me. So please don't feel sorry for me. I did end up moving to Cairns, and which was great, which is where I still am now, 30 so years later. After about 12 months, I got tired of sitting on my butt. So I started working a few days here and there just to see how my hands would go. They had improved a little, but they were far from perfect. They weren't great, but they were manageable. I could tolerate the pain, and I'd put cotton gloves on and then other gloves over the top. So patients really couldn't tell there was a problem. But it didn't take long for me to work out that working part-time was still better than the money I was actually getting from insurance payments. So I went back to work and gave up the insurance money. I just told them I didn't need it anymore. I was just going to go and do my own thing. Now, there were a few times there I was wondering if I'd made the right decision, especially when my hands flared up and I was unable to work, but I just pushed through it. And the only problem with that is the insurer would still insure me, but not for the pre-existing condition. So they would take me back on as long as my hands weren't covered. That's another story in itself. But just getting back to the second takeaway, you need to protect yourself financially, either with insurance, having good cash reserves, having money behind you, or both. As my Cairns clinic started to grow, every month I started putting a percentage of my gross revenue into what I called a rainy day account. And I'd heard somebody say this at a conference, or I may have read it in a book, that they said you should have 12 months of all expenses in a rainy day account. So that was my goal, to have 12 months of all business and living expenses covered in this account, which is exactly what I did over it was a number of years to actually get it to that point. But then as my business grew, I took it to another level and I started putting money aside for my team. Because I look at it this way, if something drastic happened, I wanted to make sure I didn't lose them. And it may only be for 3 months, but what if it was longer? To give you an example of what I mean, if you turned up to work and the building was burnt down and it was going to take a month, 2 months, or 3 months to get yourself back on your feet, would you have the money, and especially if your staff and your team were fantastic, do you have the money there to keep paying them and to look after yourself while everything is being rebuilt? That is really important. And that's what rainy day accounts and having a cash reserve is all about. Now, when I was in Glasgow, after the Foot and Ankle show, I went to Glasgow and did a workshop for the Scotland Society of Podiatry. The workshop was fun. But the day after I did my workshop, I don't know if anyone saw it in the news, but there was a massive fire at the Glasgow Central train station, well, one of the buildings there. And what had happened, at the bottom of this building, there were probably about 10 different businesses, on street front. And one of those businesses, it was a tobacco shop, surprise, surprise, caught on fire. It burned down and it took down the whole building. And every one of those businesses was gone. To the point, the building fell down, and it was interesting. I got to watch this all happen. But none of those businesses that were there, I had a photo taken the day before of that area, and I looked at some of the mum and dad and family businesses that were actually in that building, that they would have turned up the next morning and there was nothing. I think about them, I go, did you have insurance? I assume they probably did. Or do you have a cash reserve to keep team members that are really important to you, to keep them going until you find another location? And I'm sure some of those businesses, you know what, they probably never will reopen. It's just, unfortunately, that's what happens with people sometimes. So my third takeaway, it's sort of related to the second takeaway, and it's about making sure you take out travel insurance as soon as you book your airfares or as soon as you expend any substantial costs. So usually start spending any money towards your trip, your holiday, whatever it is you're going to do. Make sure you have travel insurance. For us, we were like, all our accommodation was booked through booking.com. So this is talking about the Canadian trip. And every booking had a cancellation date with no penalty. Now, here's an important point. Note down those dates. They are super important to know at what point in time you can still cancel accommodation or different aspects of your trip. You might have had day trips that you're going to do. Fortunately for us, we were able to cancel everything without any penalties whatsoever, which is great. But for some of our accommodation, we only got in by one day. At the point we decided we couldn't do the trip, we had one day before we would have actually had to pay the first night's accommodation in some places. But I did know the date and I was very aware of this. Okay, my fourth takeaway is really about planning ahead. I mentioned before that I had to cancel a number of coaching calls, but I also had to cancel a number of podcast recordings, and it was actually 4 that I cancelled. Some of these people have rebooked in for another date, which is great. Here's the problem. I didn't have any banked. I hadn't recorded enough and had them banked in case something went wrong. Usually I do, but at this point in time, I didn't, and I'd been off for so long. I was supposed to use them this week and also for the next upcoming weeks. Now, I may get someone in before then, I may not sure. Which is partly why this episode is a solo episode. However, I think this has been a blessing in disguise because these takeaways are important. It's given me time to reflect on them all. And I do think sharing these takeaways is going to help someone in the future. So you might be thinking, how does not having Podcast Bank relate to your podiatry business or your career? Here's the point. If you're heavily reliant on something or someone, you need to have a backup plan. This might sound weird. Like it could be a stock item. Think about whether it's strapping tape, semi-compressed felt. It could be scalpel blades. If it's something you heavily rely on that helps you produce income, you need to have a really, really good supply of it. You need to have more than what you think you need. This sort of stuff does not go off. So you need to have a good supply always and have a backup plan in place suddenly supplies just dry up. Now, at the moment, around the world, there's been fuel shortages and problems, and it has been affecting a few deliveries. So think ahead. I live in the tropics. We are always faced with sometimes torrential rain. We have cyclones, or in other parts of the world, you call it a hurricane. So we have to be prepared for these sort of things, that roads do get blocked off. But if it's not just a stock item, it could be a piece of equipment. If you have shockwave and you use it a lot, or if you have lasers, what happens if those machines break suddenly? How quick are you able to get these fixed? Or do you have a second one? These are the sort of things you need to plan ahead and really think about. If you use a lab for your orthotics at the moment, what would happen if that lab closed or burnt down tomorrow? Have you really thought about that? Do you have another lab that you currently use? You may have a secondary lab. And if not, have you thought about it and got one lined up in case the worst possible scenario happened? And what about additional pairs? If the lab that you've been using for years all of a sudden just decided they were closing, where will you get your second pairs done? These are things you need to think about. But this one is really important. What if a key team member, maybe a senior receptionist or experienced receptionist, front desk person, maybe a podiatrist in your team, what happens if suddenly they leave? Or worse still, they have an injury and they are off for weeks, months. You need to have a backup plan. Now, I always know with my podcast, I can do a solo episode. So it's really a no-brainer for me. Best thing is I enjoy doing them, and I'm planning on doing more solo episodes throughout 2026. But I do love having guests on the show. I love sharing their stories, and I love hearing about all the inspirational things that people are doing in our profession. And I do have some great ones lined up over the next month or so. Once some of them have rebooked, I tell you, you're going to really enjoy them. So here's a little side note too. If you are listening to this podcast and you think, you know what, I'd love to be on the Podiatry Legends podcast, please just reach out to me. Send me an email, tyson@podiatrylegends.com. Tell me a little bit about yourself. I'll check you out. And if you've got a story there, I will definitely get you on the show. And I think everybody has a story. You just got to dig a little deeper and find it. And in a previous episode I did, this relates to making sure you're planning. It was episode 339, and it was titled, Why You Need a Disaster Folder. In that episode, I explained the whole thing about planning ahead in a little bit more detail and all the things that can actually go wrong. So go and listen to that episode while it's still available, while you still can listen to it. And it's not about thinking negatively about your business or life. It's about planning, what I would say, planning for worst case scenarios, but hoping it never, ever happens. Now, it is about planning. It's about thinking ahead. It's understanding sometimes shit happens and you just got to be aware of it. You can't look or go through life with rose-colored glasses and think this will never happen to you. Now, I hope it never does, but it could. I never expected at 24 that my hands would force me to sell my podiatry clinic on the Gold Coast and not being able to work for pretty well 2 years from the time I closed it, the time I selling it, from the time I moved to Cairns, and by the time I started working it was almost 2 years. I'd never thought about that actually happening to me. Okay, my fifth and final takeaway. Don't put things off and think you'll be able to do it tomorrow. You may not be able to. We always think we have tomorrow, but really, do we? In the big scheme of things, my lower back and sciatic injury are not life-threatening. And eventually, I'm expecting I'm going to have a full recovery or be extremely close to it. And I'll be doing nearly everything back to normal pretty soon. Like I said, could be a month, could be 12 months. I don't know. But what if it was something worse? Like it was an injury that was total impairment. Or worse still, it was a death, whether it was an accident or natural causes. It's a terrible thing to think about, but it is also reality. I've had friends die. I've had a number of friends die. Some suddenly and others slowly with some form of cancers. But it was terrible. So if you don't have a will, get one. And if you have a will but it hasn't been updated for a number of years, please go and get it updated. It's one of the best things you can do. But also you need to look at other things in life that you've been putting off. And why are you putting them off? And I think this is another important question. What did you do that was more important than some of those things you know that you've been putting off? Now, I must admit, I have got a long list of things around the house, both outside and inside, that I've been putting off that needs my attention. And what's happening to me right now has been a great reminder, because there's a couple of things outside that I said I was going to do that Easter weekend and I didn't actually do them. And yes, my wife has reminded me about them, that I didn't do them. But initially, she wasn't saying it in a mean way at all. But even myself, I felt really bad that I didn't do these things before. And now it's been 4 weeks and they still haven't been done. But what if something happened to me suddenly worse than what has currently happened? And this may sound odd, but my wife would be so annoyed with me. Seriously, if I passed away suddenly with some of the things that I've been meaning to do, which I'm going to explain to you in a sec, she would be so annoyed. So just think about that. How would your partner feel about you after the initial sadness has passed? Because, of course, there's going to be mourning. And it will take some time to get over it. But once life sort of gets back on track for your family, how will they feel knowing you left a long list of unfinished or never started jobs? A list of things you were going to do one day. And like I said, I have quite a long list. Not just odd jobs around the house, like cleaning out my wardrobe and probably getting rid of some T-shirts. And if there's any ladies listening to this, and most guys I know, we find it really hard to part with T-shirts we've had for a long period of time. But it's other things, just like organising the home office, which if something did happen, of course you know your partner would do it. But now they're being forced to do it. And that is a completely different thing. But what about making sure if something happened to you, does your partner have access to all your passwords that make everything run. Now, I've actually put things in place to look after. That's one thing I have definitely done. I use an app called LastPass, which is excellent. I store all my passwords in one place with one master password to access it. I know the password. I have it recorded in a special place. Plus, as a backup, I have it with a trusted friend who I know if something happened, they know my wife will need access to those passwords. But my wife also does know the password. She knows where to go and look for it. But just remember, life without passwords or password access could be very, very difficult. So just, if that's something you haven't done yet, make sure your partner is very aware of all the passwords to everything. Unless you've got something to hide, then you may not want to do that. But I had nothing to hide. For me, though, some of the other things when you talk about putting things off, I've got a few fictional book ideas I want to write that I've spoken about for years. My wife and daughter know and love the stories that I've told them, and they keep asking me, when am I going to get started? And this is the hard thing. And this is why what's happened to me recently has been fantastic. If something happened to me and I never completed these books, one especially that my daughter absolutely loves these stories that I've told her, they would be devastated. So I want you to think about, what's your book? What's your one or two things that you've been putting on the back burner that you are going to start or do one day? My tip, start tomorrow. Start blocking out time in your ever so busy life and podiatry schedule and just take that first step. Like I said, in hindsight, this back injury has been absolutely fantastic for me. It's really given me time. It's given me 4 weeks of sitting around doing not too much at all, really thinking about life and how things can change suddenly. To wrap this episode up, I want to let you know that it is coming to the end of week 4. And yesterday, I did have a CT-guided steroid injection into my spine. Actually, it was into the S1, S2 nerve root. The second option was to putting it somewhere else, but they went with this one. And the specialist did say to me, what we're going to do by sticking this needle into your nerve root, it will hurt. And I'm thinking, okay, well, I don't mind a bit of pain. But I can honestly say I have never felt anything like that in my life. It was unbelievable. I don't mind a bit of pain. In fact, I enjoy a bit of pain every now and then. But radiating, intense, uncontrollable, deep, shooting nerve pain was more than I imagined. Now, I'm laughing about it now, but I had to apologise to the specialist for swearing so much. I don't think I've ever sworn so much in front of another person that I didn't really know. And he was fantastic. He just laughed and said, you know what? That just happens. We do these injections all the time. Don't be concerned. So I hope you've taken away a few ideas from this episode and it hasn't bored you. And I think if you've got this far, you probably realise you are getting something from it. I would really, really love your feedback. And if you're inclined to write a review for whether it's this episode or the podcast show in general, that would be great. One final thing before I finish. As this episode is being released, this is episode 417. And so far, the podcast has 42 Apple reviews and 33 Spotify reviews. So that's 75. I'm setting a goal to get to 100 podcast reviews in total by the end of 2026. So if you can help by writing a review, tell you right now, that would be fantastic. It will only take you a couple of minutes on Apple, and on Spotify, it's even faster. All you need to do, there's just a star rating there. You just click it and say what rating you want to give it. 5 stars is always good. Boom, and done. Anyway, that's it for me this week. I want you to look after yourself in more ways than I've mentioned already. Just really, really look after yourself. Look after your family, and I will talk to you again next week. Bye for now.